all for being here. It's so nice to recognize some familiar faces, some friends, and some new faces. So as Nikki said, I'm the founder and executive director of Ride My Road. We're a local anti-trafficking organization. Our vision is a world free from commercial sexual exploitation, and our mission is to empower and educate the motorcycle community and beyond, in case any of you aren't bikers here today, and to fundraise to fight against human trafficking. So a little bit about my bio. My superpower is fierce tenderheartedness. It's something I like to say because I'm a big emotional. My emotions are very big. If you know me, you know that. But I'm very fierce about it too. I don't want to take any crap when it comes to this stuff. My mom says that raising me was like trying to hold a tiger by the tail. My mom is in attendance. She's right back there. My dad is here too. He's over there, which is really nice because I get to travel and do these things all over the place, and it's really nice to be home where they can come and see. If I can't wear my boots, I don't want to go. And I believe you can use your passion for a purpose, and I also believe that you can use your pain for a purpose. Locally, I also run a media company. I do social media for other anti-trafficking organizations in the movement. I'm a local CASA advocate, and I'm on the committee for the Rogue Valley Veteran 5K that we do every year here locally. So a little bit of our impact since we founded in 2016. We've raised nearly $400,000 for survivor-led organizations. We focus on partnering with organizations that are led by survivors, offering direct support to survivors. That number is so big because of the Rogue Valley. We got our start here, and we've had so much support from all of you guys since day one, and so that's truly a collaboration. In addition to that, as a photographer, we have been able to gift 80 plus professional photo shoots to survivors, which is really a life-changing experience for survivors. We allow them to be themselves and to celebrate how far they've come, and allow them to have something tangible to show their triumphs. We've also educated thousands of community members. We've done events all over the country. And in our newest program, Disruptors University, we currently have 25 graduates. I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. But really, you're here to learn about human trafficking. So now that you've had a little bit of my background, I've been working in this now for 6 years and learning every day. This is an enormous topic. I could talk to you guys literally every day for the rest of the year, and we wouldn't touch on everything that goes into human trafficking. So first, I want to give a trigger warning. This is human trafficking. It's a very difficult subject. We'll dip a little bit into child sex trafficking, which is always hard. Just remember to please take care of yourselves. If something is too heavy or it doesn't sit right, just have some water, step out, no judgment. We just want to make sure that this is a caring environment. Be gentle of yourself and others and respectful. We all have experiences, traumas, and triumphs. We never know who's sitting next to us. And I like to say this because sometimes survivors come to hear my talks or to come to our events, and we may not know that they're survivors. So we just want to be careful. Also, we're all here to learn. And like I said, I'm learning right alongside you guys. This topic is enormous. We are challenging beliefs and understandings of a very complex issue. So just want to thank you guys for being here. You belong here, and it matters to survivors that you are here. I've met so many survivors that when they were stuck in the life of exploitation, they truly felt like nobody knew they existed, nobody cared. And the fact that people come and they show up and they want to learn about this issue, it really makes a difference in their lives. Okay, so we're going to start with an overview. I'm going to go into a little bit of a framework, then we're going to do a little bit of myth busting, and then we're going to focus on a little bit of solutions. So I know we have 2 hours to do this. I'm not going to take the 2 hours. I don't know if anybody wants to hear about human trafficking for 2 hours, but I will probably go around 45 minutes, and like Nikki said, and thank you, Nikki, we'll hold all of the questions till the end. So overview. Globally, it's a $150 billion industry. It's the fastest growing black market industry, and it runs parallel with guns and drugs. It affects 25 million people worldwide. Estimated, sometimes you might see estimations of 32 million. It's really hard to pinpoint because it is obviously, underground, and it's grossly underreported because it's really difficult to know exactly how many people are affected by this. So those are estimations worldwide. There's two main categories of human trafficking. We have labor trafficking and sex trafficking. We tend to hear more about sex trafficking in the United States. No pun intended, it's a little bit sexier. It gets like a little bit more attention. We have both in the United States, though. Labor trafficking does happen here. It's actually happening here in the Rogue Valley. We have a real uptick since we had the changeover with the grow operations. We're seeing a lot more labor trafficking here locally. And of course, sex trafficking happens anywhere the internet exists. The Polaris Project has identified 25 typologies of human trafficking within the United States. This is not all 25. This is just, I know it's a lot, but it's just to show you guys how it works. It works through all sorts of businesses. We're going to be discussing illicit massage businesses up there, but it can be escort services, domestic work, landscaping, healthcare, cleaning services, pornography, modeling services, all of it. If you want to learn more about this, the Polaris Project is the largest data collector on human trafficking in the United States. They run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So it is so prolific because it's extremely lucrative. Traffickers treat it just like any other business. And you can see where it's actually intertwined with all sorts of businesses. And this is why. Supply is endless. A drug trafficker can sell an ounce of drugs or whatever one time, but you can sell a person over and over and over again. So supply is endless. Demand is enormous. We're talking about a demand-driven industry. It's a $150 billion industry for a reason, and that is because we have a culture that has sort of culturally taught us that it's okay to purchase other people for sex. And so we have this demand issue that's not talked about enough. I get a lot of messages from people on my social media saying, hey, Lauren, like I have a daughter. I want to know, how do I protect my daughter from this issue? And I always ask them, do you have sons? Because if we could teach the next generation of sons not to purchase sex, we could eradicate human trafficking in one generation. So this really is a demand issue. The product is vulnerable people. We have a lot of vulnerable people in the world. We have a lot of vulnerable people in the country, right here in the Valley as well. People experiencing homelessness, poverty, substance abuse. And then there's like a built-in marketing department that we have in our culture as well. So you see it has all of the framework of a regular business. Here's a quote from a pimp that was told to me from a friend of mine that works at a different organization. He said, it's actually really easy to groom the girls because the culture has already done most of the work for me. So this is like when we're talking about hypersexualization, all of the stuff that happens in media and Hollywood, right? It's marketing for this issue. We talk about pimp culture, like even just saying like, oh, that's pimp. It's not really like popular to say now, or the old TV show Pimp My Ride. Like we have associated in our culture pimping with being cool, right? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about marketing. So the actual definition is very specific. It's accepted basically worldwide that it has to involve force, fraud, or coercion in exchange for labor, services, or a commercial sex act. So we're going to go through force, fraud, and coercion, and I'll show you guys examples of each. So force is the use of threats of physical violence. It's actual physical restraint. It can be kidnapping. We're going to talk a little bit about kidnapping because this is what we mostly think of trafficking in the United States. That is, it's kidnapped kids, they're in cages, it's abductions. This is actually less than 5% of actual human trafficking cases in the United States. It's not just kidnap. Yes, it happens, but it's not as prolific as we might think. So force looks like do this or I will beat you up or I'll leave and kill you. And I have heard that from almost every survivor across the board, whether that be sex trafficking or labor trafficking. Fraud is a misrepresentation of facts, false employment opportunities, Romeo pimps. So we have a survivor here locally named Rebecca Bender. Many of you probably know her. She's very famous in the anti-trafficking movement. This was how she was trafficked with a Romeo pimp, which is basically a guy comes in, pretends to be the knight in shining armor, listening for all of the vulnerabilities that she might have in order to say how he could fulfill those vulnerabilities and those needs, basically romances her, sweeps her off her feet, and then in a period of either 6 months to 3 years or even faster, will turn them out into prostitution. However, when we're talking about prostitution, if a prostituted person has a pimp, in the eyes of the law, that is a trafficker. So this is another way that in our culture we just kind of sanitize prostitution and we say, oh, she wants to be there, or she made poor mistakes, or it's empowering, when in reality, if there's a pimp involved, which is 9 out of 10 times, it's trafficking under the eyes of the law, because pimps use force, fraud, and coercion. And that looks like, I have a great job opportunity for you, or I love you, just do this one time for the both of us. That's what happened to Rebecca Bender. Her boyfriend said, hey, I spent a lot of money on you, getting you here. My bosses are really mad. I'm gonna need you to go and dance for one night, and we're gonna make this money back, and you just have to do it the one time. And it escalated from there. Coercion is the third legal term. Threats of serious harm, acts of violence are not required. Coercion is used to control a victim's state of mind and to gain compliance through fear. And that might sound like, do this or you will never see your child again. Or if you don't do it, I'll just go recruit your younger sister, right? That's coercion. So all three of those can be used to prosecute human trafficking. Also, there must be a value exchange. There must be an exchange of something of value, so money, rent, housing, basic needs. We saw this a lot during the pandemic. There was a lot of articles coming out of Hawaii, for example, of landlords not kicking women out if they would just sleep with them. That's considered human trafficking. There's an exchange of value. Okay, and then there's one more very, very important rule. When we talk about force, fraud, or coercion, that's what law enforcement needs to go ahead and prosecute a human trafficking case. None of those three are required to prove trafficking if that person is under 18. It does not need to be present. If a person is under 18 and there's any sort of value exchange, that's trafficking. So when we see in the news, child prostitute, ... we don't use that word anymore. It's not, there's no such thing as a child prostitute. There's only exploited children. Okay. We're going to talk briefly about smuggling versus trafficking. This is one of the biggest misconceptions that I have people asking me all the time about the border security, the wall, etc. Smuggling is not the same as trafficking. Smuggling does mean there's a crossing of a border. However, smuggling is voluntary. It's a person who says, I need to go across the border. Someone comes and says, I can provide that service for you. And then the relationship with the smuggler ends after the crossing. This is what is happening in the majority of cases in the United States of people wanting to come across voluntarily. Trafficking may or may not include a border crossing. It doesn't have to cross a border to be considered trafficking. And it's an involuntary relationship, and the exploitation does not end after transportation. Does this happen across the border? Yes, absolutely. But it is not as prolific as we think or as we hear in the media. And the majority of trafficking victims in the United States are United States citizens, right? Think back to what we said about prostitution. When we think about all of the people that are living in prostitution that are experiencing that, if they have a pimp, remember, so that's the majority of what trafficking looks like in the United States. We're going to go briefly over the framework, which we call the 4 B's of trafficking. And this is just to give you guys a little bit of sense, going back to that business model of where things are sitting in this issue. We have the business of it, which is the traffickers. We have the buyers, which is the demand side. We have the bought, which is the supply side. And then right in the middle, we have the bystanders, which is the majority of us who have not experienced human trafficking. That's where we're at. So again, we have traffickers, pimps in the business part. The buyers are the Johns. We call them buyers now. We don't necessarily call them Johns anymore. The bought are the victims, and we are the bystanders. So we're going to go through a couple of myths of each. So you'll see we're starting up at the business side of things. What's a myth? Traffickers kidnap their victims. Excuse me, I touched on this a little bit earlier. The reality is that the majority of cases of trafficking, the trafficker was already known to the victim or to the family. It's not stranger danger. Like I said, kidnapping and just stranger abductions is less than 5%. The next myth, trafficking can be eradicated by just arresting all the traffickers. First of all, it's very difficult to prosecute human trafficking. There has to be a really clear force, fraud, or coercion. Oftentimes, if they can show that, the victims are unwilling to testify or press charges because that's their boyfriend or that's their husband, right? So it's very difficult to prove. Most traffickers are actually prosecuted on tax evasion. The likelihood of a trafficker being arrested is 0.000000027. This is some statistics coming out of Texas. So traffickers continue to find this a profitable business. They're not getting caught. They're not getting prosecuted for this at nearly the rates that they should be. So it's nuanced, it's difficult, and it's extremely profitable. Again, showing you all of the different ways that it can be profitable. Okay, now we're going to move on to the buyers. The second B, buyer myth. Sex buyers are just all creepy dudes, or they're Hollywood people, or they're political elite, right? That's what we see when everybody goes crazy over the Jeffrey Epstein case, and that it's that when we take our attention culturally and we just focus on this, these headlines of who these buyers are, we're missing the point that the bulk of demand is made up by upper middle class, average, married, white American men. That's who's driving this. Does it happen in Hollywood? Does it happen in politics? Absolutely. But if we just focus on that side of things, we're not seeing the men in our community who are purchasing sex and asking why. And understanding that this is a $150 billion industry. These are our neighbors. These are our brothers, our fathers, these are people in our communities. They're business owners, right? So it's not just like creepy dudes. It's real men right here in our community. They come from all walks of life. They have their own stories to tell, and they're using sex buying as a coping mechanism. One of our biggest partners is the Epic Project. They're an organization based out of Portland, and this is what they do. They interface with sex buyers, so we get a lot of data from these guys. The next myth for buyers is that they're all just out of control sex addicts who need to be arrested. 60% of buyers actually, when polled, do want to stop. And again, these are just buyers who've been caught. Historically, and we see this too in culture and in the movies in Hollywood, if, like in the movies, when someone comes across like a prostitution scenario, what happens? The cops say, "Go home before I call your wife," and then the prostituted person gets arrested, right? So this is like, again, we're talking about the culture. This is finally starting to change. In fact, in places like Texas, first-time offense is now a felony for sex buying. They are really cracking down. They are a major hub for human trafficking, and they're trying to do something about it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this based on the statistics and the data that we've seen from the Epic Project. Most men buy sex because they have a void in their heart. There's a loneliness, there's something missing, and so they're going out to do that. So I also wanted to touch on that. But the thing about sex buyers is that they actually have no idea. They have no idea if the person they are purchasing wants to be there, or if that person is there through force, fraud, or coercion, right? Because if a prostituted person has a pimp, they have to act like they want to be there. So a sex buyer really cannot know. They don't know if that's commercial sex or human trafficking. So they're very intertwined, very intertwined. Okay, we're going to move on to the bot, the victims. Here's a myth that I hear a lot. Again, it's just kidnapped kids or just primarily girls. It's not just primarily girls. All ages, races, genders, socioeconomic statuses can be victimized by human trafficking. We know that boys get trafficked. It's just really underreported. Men are much less likely to come forward and say, "This happened to me." There's a lot of shame around that, some things that we're trying to bust, again, within our culture. And LGBTQIA youth, vulnerable populations, indigenous populations, they are very much affected by this. And again, it's not just kidnappings. Victims who aren't chained up can just leave. That's a myth. The truth is, it's much like domestic violence. We talked about Rebecca Bender's situation of being groomed. The psychological change can be extremely difficult to break, especially when you have someone beating you down emotionally, constantly saying, this is all you're good for, you deserve this, you can't do anything else, you don't have any skills, who's going to believe you, right? It's very similar to domestic violence. And the average person who is able to escape or exit a life of either sexual exploitation, prostitution, or human trafficking, they can have up to 12 escape attempts. And oftentimes they get murdered. Like, it's very, very, very violent. Rebecca Bender had 6 escape attempts. She had her face broken, her ribs broken, her cheekbone caved in. Like, when he would catch her trying to escape, there was very extreme consequences. So when we say, well, why don't they just leave? They're not chained, right? We need to take that into account. According to the Avery Center, domestic pimp-controlled trafficking, which is the Romeo pimp trafficking I was talking about, they meet all 15 characteristics of cultic group. So we're talking severe brainwashing. It's the isolation, it's the deconstruction of identity, it's all of the things that we see in cult behavior. So this is something that's really actually innovative, because we can start treating people who have exited prostitution in the same way that we treat people who have escaped a cult. Bystander myth, the final B. I don't belong in any of the 3 corners of the triangle. I'm not a trafficker, I'm not a buyer, and I'm not a victim, so there's nothing I can do. This is a big myth. Simply by showing up here today, you guys are doing something about it. Taking a stand, saying, I have to learn about this. I want to talk about this with my friends. Men in particular, you have influence, right? For the next generation of men. I don't know anybody who could be trafficked. This is another myth. I mentioned sometimes survivors show up to these talks and nobody even knows they're survivors. They are walking among us. They can be anybody in the community who is facing a vulnerability. So when we look at our community, who are our single mothers, our runaway children, people experiencing houselessness, people exiting domestic violence, these people are all vulnerable for human trafficking. And actually, any one of us is. I started Ride My Road because I was in an emotionally abusive marriage. I never would have thought that that would have happened to me. I come from a good family, I'm educated, confident. It didn't matter. Anybody can be swept up in something like this. Nobody's exempt from abuse. You have influence, okay? So I want you to be thinking about your spheres of influence as we go into this next section of issues on the rise. This is a kind of a water hose of some. I mentioned to you guys that this topic is so enormous and nuanced. I could talk to you about it for a year and we would not touch all of the topics. Here's 5 topics that I have seen in the 6 years that I've been doing this, like, really come to the forefront of my radar. And so I just want you to be thinking about where would you fit in some of these topics, and who do you have influence with? So the first one is the intersectionalities. Okay, trafficking exists at the intersection of poverty, racism, oppression, and generational trauma. It has its roots in the United States dating all the way back to colonialism and the slave trade. I mean, it's very, very similar. At first glance, when we look at those similarities, trafficking is still primarily white men purchasing black and brown bodies of women and people from those vulnerable populations experiencing poverty. And this is the sex trade in general, not just human trafficking. This is what we're seeing. So I hope you guys can I hope I'm explaining it right? We look at slavery all the way to where we are. It's still happening. So to get into the nitty-gritty of that, I'm going to just throw up some statistics. In King County, Washington, 52% of all child sex trafficking victims are black, though black girls only comprise 1.1% of the general population, right? There's something seriously wrong here. This is Washington State. In Connecticut, 73% of referrals of trafficking children were children of color. I don't know the map of Connecticut, but I'm guessing it's a primarily white state. In Louisiana, 49% of child sex trafficking victims are black girls, though they only comprise 19% of Louisiana's youth population. And in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 65% are black, though black people are only 27% of the population, right? So this is just to show you guys, this is trending nationwide. These statistics come from each area of these states, but they're compiled by an organization called Rights for Girls. So if you want to focus on the intersectionality portion and think about your sphere of influence, if you work in healthcare, if you're supporting the unhoused, if you work in education, or you're having contact with vulnerable populations, please be thinking about those intersectionalities: generational trauma, racism, oppression. It all comes into play when we're talking about human trafficking. The next issue on the rise I want to call attention to is familial trafficking. This one's really, really hard. This is when the family member is the trafficker. And we're talking primarily about children. This is where exploitation is normalized. It's accepted within the family culture. We talk about it being generational. It sometimes can span generations. I've met and photographed so many survivors that their moms were prostitutes right before we knew what this was. And it just gets passed down, and that's all they know. And they're growing up around pimps, and they're just, this is how it happens. The other way that it happens is I have photographed survivors who come from upper middle class white neighborhoods, and that they were trafficked by their family members at their church, and just nobody knew. So it's not just like back alleys and these situations, they are right here in our neighborhoods. We know this happens here. In the United States, according to the Department of State, 41% of child sex trafficking cases are facilitated by a family member. Because we have to think about access. Who has access to these kids? The family members. So what this looks like oftentimes is it starts as molestation, and it continues long enough to where the abuser thinks, hey, I'm not getting caught with this. I actually know I have friends that would be into this, and so they start to sell that child to their community of men. Yeah, it's really hard. I've photographed so many familial trafficking survivors, and those survivor leaders are screaming that we're not talking about this. This is enormous. So if you want to focus on the familial trafficking in your work or in your spheres of influence, you may work in education, have children, no children, have any contact with children. And again, this is just an overview. If you guys want to learn more about this, we have tons of resources on how to actually spot this. My friend Christine is a survivor leader who was trafficked by her father, and she talked a lot about how she went to school every day. And she was sleeping in school because she was out working at night. Nobody saw the signs. They just thought she was a bad student. She was not allowed to do sleepovers with friends. She virtually had no friends her age, no peer friends. So there was some signs, and she teaches a great course on that. She's actually on our board of directors as we start to expand more into educating on this. So the next issue on the rise, massage parlors. So we also call these illicit massage businesses, or the illicit massage industry. It's an establishment that puts on a facade of a legitimate massage business in order to facilitate commercial sex services. This is often human trafficking. I just read a statistic this morning. I believe 87% of people trapped in illicit massage businesses are Chinese. So this is where we are talking about the smuggling, where they are often brought over either against their will or voluntarily thinking they might have a job, and then it becomes an indentured servitude type situation. The average woman who is trapped in this owes their bosses $42,000, which is a sum they will never be able to make up because they're constantly being charged for things. They also don't have access to their own documents, and they are very afraid of police, immigration. They don't speak English, right? This is one of the fastest growing crimes in the United States right now. We're talking about a $4.3 billion industry in the United States. There are more illicit massage businesses in the US than all of the Burger King's and KFC's locations combined. Okay, we had 2 busts in our area last year. They busted one in Grants Pass, and they busted one in Medford. So this is happening. This is happening here. Guaranteed, no matter where you live, if you're watching this online, Google your city and state and see what's happening with this in your area. Okay, so if you're interested in focusing on this type of sphere of influence, and you can, if you work in healthcare, if you're a local business owner, right, start paying attention to what kind of business permits are going out and who's working where. And, oftentimes these massage parlors have no branding. It might just say massage and the curtains are drawn. And you're kind of like, how are they marketing this place? Like, there's no phone number, right? So if you enjoy massage too, be thinking about, hey, where am I going? What's it like here? Okay, so the next issue on the rise is online sexploitation or self-generated CSAM. I'm going to explain this. This is right up there with familial trafficking and massage parlors, except it's growing through COVID when we had a lot of kids at home, a lot of kids on the internet. The majority of kids now have their own devices. This is a big one. So what is CSAM? CSAM is child sexual abuse material. We used to call it child porn. We don't call it child porn anymore because child porn implies some sort of consent, right? And if they're under 18, they cannot consent no matter what the circumstances are. So we now refer to it as CSAM or child sexual abuse material. So this is fast growing, obviously with the internet, but what's even more alarming is self-generated CSAM. And this is where the child or the teen takes the photos of themselves, nudes, usually through coercion or peer pressure. 39% of teens, when polled, said sharing nudes is normal among their peers, right? But what happens to those images, right? We find these images on the black web. We're actually seeing an uptick in youth suicides because someone is coercing those photos from them, and then they say, I'm going to tell your mom if you don't send me more pictures, more elaborate scenes, more degrading things, and then these kids are committing suicide. There's been several prominent cases of this across our country. So, 39% is a big deal. So we call that self-generated child sexual assault material. So if you have a sphere of influence and you're interested in CSAM, if you're a parent, if you know a parent, if you know any small children with devices, get some education on what's going on those devices. We have some great resources for keeping your kids safe online. And actually, the Surgeon General just came out yesterday and said he did not believe anybody at 13 should have social media. He's recommending more like 16 or 17 years of age before kids should be allowed to have social media. He made a statement that they're still evolving their identities, but that goes hand in hand with being coerced and meeting someone nice online who says, oh, your parents are getting a divorce, that's really sad, and then they start to build this relationship, and we see it all the time. So if you interact with children in any capacity, you should be learning about this. Okay, last one. Issue on the rise that has really been on my radar is policy and legislation. Many states in the United States right now are facing legislation to decriminalize prostitution. There's a very large pro-sex work lobby that is moving from state to state trying to get this passed. However, okay, so just to explain what that means that prostitution no longer becomes criminalized. So the argument is that sex work is work, that it's empowering, that the government should have no business policing people's bodies, right? That's the argument we get. But in reality, in countries across the world where they have implemented these policies, we always see an uptick in human trafficking, right? As I explained earlier, we have no idea who really wants to be there and who's being coerced to be there. Rebecca Bender, before her escape, it took her 2 years after her escape, when she heard something on the news, to even identify that she was a victim of trafficking. Her whole situation, she felt she was just a prostitute, right? So she says she grew up in the same culture that we did. She had a trafficker. She had a pimp, 2 of them. He sold her to a different one, right? So how will we know how much of this sex work in the sex work industry is trafficking if even the people who are being victimized can't recognize it, right? So that when we're talking about decriminalization of prostitution, we don't have the infrastructure to handle all of the victim services for what that might mean. We also, if it's decriminalized, we don't have enough supply. There is not enough willing women out there to provide the supply for the $150 million demand that we are experiencing. So when that gets decriminalized, we will see human trafficking go through the roof, undoubtedly. So last year in Oregon, we faced this legislation. It didn't make it through the House bill, so we have a self-proclaimed sex buyer, millionaire from Portland. He's actually from the West Coast, but he has a property here. He was able to have a ballot measure to put forth decriminalizing prostitution. We fought it with a lot of opposition with our partner orgs, and the ballot was withdrawn. We fully anticipate him to resubmit that at some point. So this is why I want this to be on your guys' radar. Instead of just reading that little ballot measure that says this is a human rights issue, like really understand what this will do for our state. Oregon would become a sex tourism capital of the world, which will attract traffickers, it will attract buyers, it will attract all kinds of things that we are not prepared for. We don't have the infrastructure for this. So this is why I say full decriminalization is very high on our radar at Ride My Road. We've been working with this. So if you are interested in focusing on the full decriminalization in your spheres of influence, are you a social justice warrior involved in politics or policy making, or if you're good at canvassing, fundraising, this might be a good place to put your attention. Okay, so if you want to know more, like I said, more in depth, because this is an overview, we do have a lot of online training. We have Disruptors University. We invite anybody to come to our online university. We bring in some of the biggest professionals, bless you, biggest professionals from the movement to talk about different facets of the movement. And it's open to anybody. We are pretty close to launching a business owner edition for the Rogue Valley. So if you guys are business owners or you have employees or you want to know what this will look like for your business, we'll be opening that up here pretty soon. We'll take a deep breath. It was a big fire hose. It's a lot of information. Relax your shoulders down from your ears. So here's a couple of ways you can take action based on kind of what we just learned. You can get educated. Like I said, you can sign up for our online university. Ours is not the only education out there. There's tons of places you can go to get educated. Read books written by survivors. I talked in the beginning about our focus to work with survivor leaders and organizations that are led by survivors because they have obviously a very intimate and unique understanding of this issue that most people will never have. If you're supporting an anti-human trafficking organization, please make sure that they have survivors on their boards, that they're survivor informed. This is very important. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of sensationalized imagery. There's a lot of things that just point to kidnapped white girls with blonde hair, right? If I see that from an org, I pretty much know they're not survivor informed because that's not what it actually looks like. So read books written by survivors. I have a list of phenomenal ones. Rebecca Bender, who I've been talking about, has 3 books. You can read about her story. And then another thing you can do is just build solid relationships with your children, but also with your community. You know, we have to stand together as a community to say we're not going to tolerate this. We're not going to tolerate this in the Rogue Valley. We're not going to tolerate it here. We care about our vulnerable populations. You know, if your Black Lives Matter, you should be caring about this issue as well. It affects minority populations. And then look for the vulnerable populations in your area. So who are our single moms? You know, what's going on at Maslow Project? What's going on at Dunn House? Community Works, like support these organizations that are actually boots on the ground working with these vulnerable populations. CASA is another phenomenal organization. I've been a CASA for a couple of years now. If you don't know about them, it's court-appointed special advocates, and you get appointed to just be a person involved in the life of a kid in foster care. And kids, we didn't even get into the foster care system and how that's a pipeline for human trafficking, but children who have a CASA are 97% less likely to be rehomed in an abusive situation, right? So there's things we can do. Okay, before I get into questions, because that's my presentation, I did want to give a special shout out to Rosa in the back. Rosa is the coordinator for the Jackson County Coalition Against Sex Trafficking, JCAST. So she's fairly new to the position. She's already doing incredible things. So that coalition is operated out of Community Work. So be sure and give her a shout out and say hi, and if you have any questions. Sound good?
Thank you. That's
okay.
Good.
Yeah. All right. I put you on the spot. Okay. Questions.
I don't have a question as much as the comment about 39% of teenage kids think it's normal to give nude pictures. That's concerning. Where they get that idea that it's normal, that to me is a real stark problems.
Yeah.
I think it's okay.
I mean, I think back to my age, and you can think back to all of your ages. What were you being peer pressured to do when you were that age? You know, smoke, drink,
Yeah.
make out, whatever it is. I mean, we know that the internet has just escalated things, specifically when we talk about the issue of pornography. Back in the day, if you were a 12-year-old kid and you were interested, you might sneak into your dad's closet or under the bed and like look at some topless women. Okay, now when a 12-year-old is interested, and actually we're finding reports that children as young as 7 and 8 are being exposed to pornography, right? They go to the internet. And they aren't just seeing topless women, they're seeing hardcore violence. It's very, 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 very violent stuff that they're seeing, and it's changing their brains. There's a lot of studies out there. That's why a lot of states have declared pornography as a public health crisis. Excuse me. And a lot of people are like, why are you wasting your time on that? Well, the science is like pretty alarming. So yeah, some of it's peer pressure, some of it's just like we said, being groomed by the culture.
No, I do have a question. How many states have legal prostitution?
None.
Nevada doesn't?
Okay, so there's a difference between legalization and decriminalization.
Oh.
And Nevada is kind of like everybody thinks it's legal in Vegas. It's not. There's 12 counties or 11 counties within within Nevada, where it is decriminalized. It's also, you might hear of like Bunny Ranch or some of the brothels out there. I have photographed survivors that say that is the most violent situations they have ever been in. It's horribly run. So, this argument that if we just decriminalize it, we can mitigate the violence in a very innately violent industry. It's not really the case. They have decriminalized it in Germany. They have 7-story brothels where they had to outlaw pillows.
Amsterdam too.
Yeah, they had to take the pillows out of the brothels because too many men were suffocating the women. This is violent.
So we'd be the only state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we were fighting tooth and nail against that. Yeah. Other questions?
How about in Indian restaurants? I was with the owner and one of his friends. This was in Southern California a number of years ago. And the friend explained to me that some of his workers were based kind of like slaves in that they were brought over from India and then they worked off their debt at the restaurant. And evidently they don't get the tips. So I was in an Indian restaurant locally and I asked the guy, "Do you get the tips?" And he said no, basically. So I guess it's here also. It appears to be.
Yeah, I mean it's hard to tell, right? That's why we have to be paying attention, I think, right? Because you had that experience there, and now you're kind of you're more aware of it wherever you go. Yeah, and it just depends. Is there force, fraud, and coercion there? Is it indentured servitude? Is it just a family cultural thing where you just don't? That's just not how the family works. Can they come and go as they please? Do they have access to their own documents? Right? There's a lot of things, but yeah, I'm glad that you have your radar up about that.
So on a first contact basis, though, how do you identify something like that? What kind of questions should you ask?
At a restaurant?
Anywhere.
Well, I would say it's probably best not to confront anybody. I would call the hotline because you never know when you could get a victim or a person in more trouble. And I learned that from survivors, like when people were kind of alarmed and they were concerned, and then they would kind of like maybe say something or change their behavior, they would get worse beatings later. So I would recommend always calling the hotline, put it on their radar. They might already be working a case there. Same with like if you see something like at a hotel or a truck stop, they might already have that license plate on file, and they might now have that information of, oh, they're one state over now. So the human trafficking hotline, I think, is the best place to go if you're suspecting. And as far as learning the signs, just get educated. I mean, you can come to our university, or just Google some of the news and see like, oh, I didn't know that was happening here.
What is the hotline?
The hotline is 1-800.
373-7888.
Yeah. You can, if you just Google it, it comes right up. I should actually have it here. And there's also a text number.
Write it.
I could write it over here. Okay. What was that, Rosa?
1-888-373-7888. Lots of eights in there.
That's good.
And that is,
Like it's somehow people remember that.
Well, isn't the suicide hotline 888
I don't know that one by heart.
nationally?
It's 988.
It's 988?
yeah, they have a text number as well. Thank you, Rosa. And that is run by the Polaris Project. They have a ton of resources on their website for this kind of a thing. Yeah. Questions?
And what about the slavery and the growing operations?
Yeah, Rosa might know more about this, but Jackson County has launched a special task force for it, and they're working really hard at it. We also have a task force just for the child sexual assault material I was telling you about. There have been a lot of busts locally for internet crimes against children. But yeah, they're working on it. I know that I think 2 years ago, they were asking the governor to declare a state of emergency for human trafficking for the grow ops. I'm not really sure what happened with that. I don't know if you know, Rosa.
For the what ups? I'm sorry.
The grow operations,
Oh.
the
Marijuana.
marijuana and the hemp, yeah.
They're exploiting.
Workers, yeah. Primarily
Oh.
Mexican workers, laborers. Yeah.
So, how can people donate to your organization?
Oh, I should have put that, yeah. This is the marketing guru over here. Yeah. Actually, I do have, right there is our website. So you can reach me at lauren@ridemyroad.org, and ridemyroad.org, we have a donation page there. And yeah, we're really, I've been kind of focusing, not internationally, but across the United States, talking about this issue with bikers, and because of the pandemic and then the policy that we've been facing as an organization, we are refocusing back to the Rogue Valley to work on this right at home, because as we know, it's happening right here. And so that's what we'll be focusing on with funds, is really building programs to, again, help business owners get educated, and so we can, I have a dream of, with Rosa too, like, having 100, 150 business owners going through the program and growing from there until we as a valley can say, we don't tolerate this here. Like, our business owners are educated, our citizens know what to look for, we're supporting our vulnerable populations. Why not? Why not let the Rogue Valley be a beacon against this?
That's right.
We're smart
You're the
enough,
first state, too.
we're such a connected community. So.
Just a bonus question. What statistics do you have in terms of dating apps? And there's something happening in Grants Pass
Yeah.
right now.
Standoff, yeah.
Yeah. So do you have any information on that? Like how vulnerable are?
I don't know about, do you mean do you know, Rosa?
No,
I was
Nancy,
thinking about,
finish your thoughts, sorry.
yeah, just recruitment, if we're talking about Romeo pimps, I'm sure there's a lot of recruitment happening on dating apps. I don't know of any specific statistics. We see a lot happening with OnlyFans and some of the websites. Raise your hand if you know about OnlyFans. A couple people. Okay. So OnlyFans came out a couple of years ago, and it's basically a subscription-based service where, I could get on and have a private page and someone could subscribe to my page by paying for content. And OnlyFans is like, basically it's personalized pornography. And it was very, very fast growing through the pandemic when people were working from home. There's a huge demand for it. There's a couple of people out there that are, you know, they've made millions and millions of dollars, and they're touting this as like a really great, empowered way to make a living. And the demand for it, again, is so high. We're seeing a ton of exploitation on that app. The Avery Center did a whole report on it. I don't have it on my website, but I can get it to you if you're interested, just how much exploitation is taking place on those types of apps. So it's not a dating app per se, but very, very similar. And there was a case a couple of months ago. I don't know if it's a case, but there was a situation where there was a woman on Twitch, which is a different app where you can do like gaming, and people can subscribe and watch you game. She was a very famous Twitch operator, millions and millions of followers, and she would play games like in bikinis and stuff. And she just got on her channel one day and was like, I'm not going to do this anymore. My husband's been forcing me to do this. And she laid out human trafficking like to a T in front of millions of followers. So we know this stuff's happening. Yeah.
Question from the writing community. I know from the 1% perspective and a lot of those kind of motorcycle gangs and stuff like that, there are human trafficking aspects coming from within the writing community.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the question was about human trafficking within the motorcycle community. I mean, the motorcycle community has its roots going back to the 60s in crime, right? That was the Hells Angels, and there was a lot of drug trafficking, human trafficking. And while that was sort of a legacy for bikers, it really has evolved like quite a bit. We're seeing so many subcultures in the motorcycle community, and that's why those guys are called the 1%ers, because there's not that many of them left. Does it happen? Absolutely. We were invited to Sturgis, the Sturgis Rally, which is the largest motorcycle rally in the world, held in South Dakota every year. I think they're on their 85th annual. Trafficking happens there all the time. It's a hypersexualized event, and you know, trafficking happens there. So that's kind of why we have a unique position as a motorcycle charity to go out and talk to guys about this issue, especially among bikers, because the whole deal with being a biker is like freedom, right? Like, we care about freedom. Don't tell me what to do. And we're also trafficking people. Like, it just doesn't make sense. However, I will say that we see an uptick in trafficking at Sturgis, just like we see an uptick in trafficking at the Super Bowl, or tech events, or climate change events. Anytime there is a large group of men migrating from away from their home zip codes, trafficking increases. And it does not matter. You know, you hear the Super Bowl is the biggest human trafficking day of the year. It's not true. There's no real statistics to back that up. Does it increase? Absolutely. But again, it also increases at tech conferences, all sporting events. Again, anytime there's a large group of men, you know, coming from outside of their home zip codes, they think like, oh, whatever happens in this zip code stays in this zip code. We see that. So it's not just biking events.
All right. Is there any effort to get education out into like the high schools?
Yes.
Any programs going on
Yes.
for that?
That's what's so encouraging about working in this movement is there's so many phenomenal organizations. We all have our lanes. I don't tend to work a ton with youths, but we have partners that do, and Rosa has resources for that as well. But yeah, we have a lot of partner organizations. I mentioned the EPIC project. They're launching a whole prevention initiative for high school age kids called My Friends Are Not For Sale. So we'll be learning more about that in the next year. But what we're learning, you know, I talked about people buying sex being a heart issue and a loneliness issue. What we're seeing among sex buyers is that they don't have a sense of belonging, right? So if we can promote a sense of belonging within our children so that they don't have those holes in their hearts and they're not out searching and feeling alone, and they're not allowed to talk about their problems because they might seem weak, or, right, we have to let boys emote We have to let boys have connections, and we have to really promote male friendship. That is the biggest deterrent to human trafficking. It sounds crazy, but so when we're talking about prevention, that's what we're talking about. Instilling self-worth in the girls and instilling a sense of belonging for the boys. Yep. Thank you all so much for coming. Oh, question?
Well, I just remember reading recently about, they're finding children working in slaughterhouses, cleaning slaughterhouses, and that most of them seem to be undocumented
In the United States?
in the United States.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
in Minnesota is one of the states, but I also thought of all the undocumented a couple of years ago when they separated the children from their parents and
Right.
what, 2,000 some went
Yeah.
missing?
What happened to them? Absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you for what you do.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Bringing this forward,
Yeah.
especially in this community.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're so equipped. We're so equipped in this community to make a difference. We just have to get the word out. You know, we all have things we want to focus on. Like, we have a big pollinator community here, and we have a big, like, there's all of these things we're passionate about, supporting the homeless crisis, the houselessness crisis. But they're all sort of intertwined, right? So if we can just keep coming together like this and thanking organizations like Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library for hosting these types of events and just being together. This post-pandemic time is really exciting. So thank you. Thank you.